Well, let's change gear and take a look at this now. ANC MP Thoko Didiza will lead Parliament's ad hoc committee on land expropriation. The committee will introduce legislation to amend Section 25 of the Constitution. This will allow for expropriation without compensation. Well, what exactly are the committee's timelines? We're joined by the chairperson, Thoko Didiza. Mr. Didiza, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Firstly, let's just talk about the approach that you'll be taking as the chair of this committee.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and I would like to greet your listeners. Indeed, Parliament, before it rose for its recess in December last year, took a decision to set up an ad hoc committee whose task would really be taking over the work that was done by the Constitutional Review Committee to look at the amendment of the Constitution, in particular Section 25. Yesterday, the committee met for its first time and elected a chairperson. And next week, on the 22nd of February, the committee will then agree on its program of work, which indeed would outline the processes that would be followed. As you know, that one of the issues that we need to consider is the drafting of the legislation. And in terms of our lawmaking process, when a bill has been drafted, it has to be released at least for 30 days for public comment. And thereafter, the committee will then take into consideration the various views that would be articulated by the citizenry and broad stakeholders to then determine how they actually finalize that process. So the 22nd will really be an important milestone in the work of the committee when it agrees on its program of action.
Certainly, the actual drafting of that legislation is going to be where you meet a lot of contestation, because many groups from across the spectrum are watching to see the wording of how exactly this expropriation without compensation is going to take, what are the parameters that is going to operate within. So with that in mind, do you have an idea of how you're going to balance all of these interests?
Actually, one of the guiding principles that the committee will have to take into consideration is to take the views that emerged out of the constitutional review. And I think it's important for all of us to appreciate that that process of public consultation, there are certain commonalities that emerged across our society, that the issue of land reform in South Africa is actually key for the development of the country. The issue of equitable access to land is also important. And the appreciation that indeed, if you look at Section 25 of the Constitution, it does balance the issues of, property rights as well as the state's obligation to undertake land reform, taking into consideration the history of our country. I think what is at issue is the constitutional mechanism in terms of Section 25 explicit enough in terms of what its intention is supposed to be, with particular the state's responsibility in undertaking land reform. If you look at those mechanisms and in terms of the work of the Constitutional Review Committee, there are certain proposals that were made as to where are the areas that you might need to provide for that explicit. The other views that emerged was that the Constitution as it stands is explicit enough. Maybe the government has not taken advantage of what is in the Constitution to actually undertake land reform. One of those arguments that other people have made is that the government has not actually passed the law of general application that will empower the state to undertake land reform. So in navigating that work, the committee, in my view, would have to look at what has come out in terms of where people have said we need to be clear enough. What are those sections of Section 25? Similarly, the committee will have to look as to if you deal with Section 25, are there other consequential, amendments that you might need to make on other sections of the Constitution? If there are, which ones are those? If they are not, how then do you proceed? So it has got, in my view, the committee, an important work to do, understanding the agency, but understanding the sensitivity as well, that you are dealing with the supreme law of the land, and therefore you need broad consensus on how you want to move forward.
At the same time, the President also set up a land advisory panel, which, of course, has been looking at the different elements of what would need to go into drafting of legislation. Will you be working together with them? What role will they have in terms of just ensuring that you don't have these groups that are collecting information and Parliament working in silos?
It's important to appreciate that even when the Constitutional Review Committee undertook its work, it was alive of some of the outcomes of the work that was done by the high-level panel that was set up by the Speakers Forum, led by our former President, Mr. Motlanthe. It also took into consideration the work that was happening within government. And I'm sure this committee would also take into consideration the work of the panel that has been set up by the President. But as you appreciate, that the work of the panel, in my view, is also looking as to what are the current things that you need to do that are already provided for by the law. What are the other measures that you would have to put in place to actually determine where expropriation has to happen without compensation or even with compensation? What are those areas? How do you identify the specific land parcels that you might need to deal with? So there is a relationship, even though there's some distinct responsibilities of what the committee, the ad hoc committee, has to do, as well as the panel that has been set by the President.
Lastly, Mr. Didiza, the issue of time is of the essence here, because we know that this topic is one that all political parties seem to be canvassing support around. So when we look at that 8th May election date, as you anticipate just the load of work you're going to need to do, will it be done before elections?
What I can say is that let's wait for the committee to have its first meeting where it determines its program. I think that will be the guide for all of us as to how much time is being required to undertake this task. And we must also remember that even last year, we agreed in February that the Constitutional Review must undertake its work. We put the timeline in September. But because we understood the sensitivity around the matter of that we're dealing with, that time had to be extended. So my own view is that as the committee does its work and decides on its program, it would look at the factors that are important in the amendment of this section, and then will come up with an appropriate program, which will then be announced for all of us to know what are the timelines.
All right, let's leave it there for this afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. Thoko Didiza, the newly appointed head of the Parliamentary Committee that's going to look at the amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution.